we actually can get sea salt from Croatia here in Chicago. And so being Croatian, I was like, wow, this is kind of,
Yeah.
yeah, right. Oh, this is even
Why
cooler.
not go the full length and make it home style? Yeah.
Right. So I actually use Croatian sea salt. Now, some of those impurities in there, I'm sure that there is some natural nitrates and nitrites and whatnot that are in that sea salt that actually cause a catalyst and cause that meat to be preserved a little bit differently than if I would use kosher salt. But here's the deal. If you're just starting out and you just want to give it a try, use kosher salt. Kosher salt is a excellent salt to cure meat, and most professionals would recommend kosher salt. And don't use coarse grain kosher salt. You want to use fine grain kosher salt.
Penetration, yeah.
Correct. Better penetration. If you're using the big rock salt or large crystals, it'll sit on the surface a little bit too long. You want it to immediately penetrate to start extracting water as quickly as possible.
Very good point.
Yeah.
By the way, the viewers, we are going to nerd out about this. So we love this topic. So expect that we're going to go into deep details.
Yeah.
Love the topic. And
sadly,
this is very important information that you're getting. So
we're only scratching the surface. Yeah. We're only scratching the surface too. So we could go for 8 hours about this, but obviously nobody is going to sit and listen. So
there's a few, I bet, but
yeah.
Yeah, it's a very important fact about salt. Thank you.
Yeah. So now the next step, okay, I've weighed my meat. I've found the salt. I know how much salt I need to add to my meat. Now you're going to take the meat and you're going to put it, I use food grade bins. So I bought some plastic bins off of Amazon.
Wooden crates or that's
Right. And so that's very interesting that you say that, because the next step of the process is actually probably one of the most critical. And in the old country, when they would put it in on wooden planks, right, and then they would leave it out in a shed, and it would be 35, 40 degrees outside at the most.
Yeah.
Now what would happen is that salt starts doing its magic. It starts to
the water. Yeah.
Right. It starts pulling out that water, and what happens is when you're doing it the traditional way on a wooden plank, that water just simply spills out and goes onto the ground, which is usually a dirt floor, and it didn't matter.
Yeah.
Today, and actually I did this last winter, I was curing a ham in my garage, and I didn't realize how much water was going to come out of this ham. I don't know, one of those, man, there was salt water everywhere. And my wife was like, what are you doing? And God bless her. She puts up with a lot of my experiments, this, that, the other. She's like, can you please just not do this here? But anyhow, so I use a plastic food grade bin, and I bought lids for it. You can buy them on Amazon. They're $20. And the reason I like to put lids on them is so I could stack them up in the refrigerator, or if the temperature is right, I just leave them in my garage and I keep the lid on them just to keep the air out. Now the first day, so if I salt it 24 hours later, the amount of water that's come out of that piece of meat is probably going to be the maximum amount of water that's going to get extracted. It's that first 24 hours, depending on the size of the meat, the bone structure, everything else, the first 24 hours is hands down the worst. And so 24 hours later, I go back out, I take the lid off, I take the meat out, and I put it on a sanitized surface, which is usually the lid of the container. And then I take that water that's in that bin and I dump it out.
Right.
I wash out the bin, I re-sanitize it, I put the meat back in, and if the meat was facing one way, I flip it over. And this just allows that equilibrium, that equalization to occur. So this period that we're in now, from the point that I put the salt on to the point where it's ready to smoke, this period I call the equalization period. And what that means is if I have a piece of meat, the salt is now on the outside of that piece of meat. That salt has to penetrate all the way to the center for it to be properly cured. If it doesn't penetrate all the way to the center, what's going to happen is that meat will never be properly dried, and that centerpiece is going to be a bacterial infection waiting to happen. And actually, I've experimented a couple times, and I was like, gosh, 3% salt. I've got high blood pressure. Maybe I should try using a little bit of less. Yeah, right. Well, let's make
just buy a treadmill and
yeah, right. Exactly. That's exactly right. So I tried 2.5%. I tried 2%, and let me tell you, the results were bad. They were very bad. You want to make sure that salt equalizes all the way to the center of the piece of meat, and the only way to do that is to add enough salt to the meat to get it to work properly. Otherwise, it's just going to be a problem down the road. So start with 3%. Now, that bin, we pulled the meat in, and now every day, especially for the first week, every day we should go out there, open it up. If there's any excess water, take it out, wash it off, put it back in, flip the meat. Every day we should flip the meat. And that part of that is just to, and again, this is just my opinion, I feel like flipping the meat helps it equalize a little bit better.
Also, water is gravity, so it's always going to be wetter on the other side. So you want to equalize it. Yeah.
Exactly.
When you're stacking Slanina that high,
it's
very important to flip all of them.
That's exactly right. That's 100% right. So now we've allowed this meat to equalize, and people always ask me, well, how long should I let it sit in there, right? Is it 3 days? Is it 5 days?
Yeah.
And a good rule of thumb, in my opinion, is a day per pound, right? So if my average weight on my pork loin is 8 pounds, and I've got 5 of them or 6 of them stacked in a container, I want to allow that curing process to occur for at least 8 days. So if it's 10, then it's 10 days. In the case of a prosciutto, like I did this last year, it was 19 pounds. So I wanted to make sure at a minimum to allow it to equalize over a 20-day period. Now, at that point, in theory, that salt should have had enough time to penetrate to the center of the meat and extract that excess water out. And now this meat is stable, and it can move to the next step in the process. Now, the next step in the process is one of two things. You're either smoking the meat or you're not smoking the meat. And that all is, again, dependent on the style of meat that you're curing and your personal preference. So I have a friend who loves cured meat but can't stand when people smoke it. So for him, I make a couple loins and I always smoke it only for 4 or 5 hours, just a little bit, just a kiss, a hint of smoke, a kiss.
Just to taste it,
Yeah, and I understand, because at some point, for instance, when I'm making barbecue and I smoke a pork shoulder on my smoker, something about that pork being smoked for 12, 16 hours, and I eat it, I get heartburn. And so
smoke has its own effect. Yeah.
Exactly. And now, again, another tree branch. Smoke, there's a million different factors when it comes to smoke. So you take the meat out, you put it in your smoker, and we only cold smoke meat.
Yeah, I wanted to point out the difference that you were talking about smoking and then smoking, but there's cold smoking that you do mostly for preservation and taste. And then there's hot smoking, or actually cooking the meat with smoke, right?
Exactly.
So there's the difference. What we were talking mostly about here was cold smoking. So once the meat has been cured, you put it in your cold smoker, and we'll talk about that a little bit in order to help it preserve and also give it the right taste. But do ahead, continue.
Exactly. So cold smoking is a process where the smoke enters into the chamber approximately 65 to 75 degrees, and then it will filter up to the meat and just bathe the meat in smoke for a period of time. So cold smoking essentially, at this point now you're talking personal preference, right? You number one, the type of wood that you choose is critical. the amount of time that you leave it in your smoker is critical. And how you allow that smoke to come into your smoker is actually very, very important. So my personal preference, I love applewood for smoking. Applewood makes a fantastic flavor, and cherry. So cherry and apple are my two preferred types of wood that I use when I smoke. Cherry gives it a beautiful, beautiful mahogany color.
Yeah, the color will be nice.
Oh my gosh, it's unbelievable. And applewood, in my opinion, just tastes great. So I'll intermittently switch apple and cherry, and I'll smoke a few different batches. I'll do one batch with a few different types of wood, so it gets a little bit of both. But cherry on its own is also excellent. You can't go wrong with either. But interestingly enough, I did all cherry wood batch last year on some pork loins, and it actually had the aftertaste, a faint aftertaste of cherries.
Wow.
It was incredible. I was eating it and I'm like, oh my gosh, I taste cherries on this stuff, you know? So you got to be a little careful too. You want to make sure with your wood that you're mixing it up and doing different things.
When you're saying wood, now, especially I think apple wood, you would be using the chunks, right? Not because there are different ways how to do this. So you could use forgage, basically wood shavings, pellets, I guess, and then also wood blocks or chunks, right? And what do you prefer and why?
So again, great question. I prefer whole logs. If I can do it, I prefer a whole log, and then I light a fire and allow it to burn, you know, for the night. I don't like pellets. Personally, I think they give the wood a chemically, and again, this could all be psychological. I feel like it gives the wood a fake flavor.
Yeah.
You know, it's just not good. The little chips are great for a quick smoke, but if you're doing it long term, you'd have to continuously add wood chips to it. And because they're smaller pieces, I feel like you get more soot on the meat.
Yes, it will be that taste, and it will be different for sure.
It's almost like a tar. I believe it's called creosote, right? So when you're cleaning out your chimney, you're going to get a lot of creosote on the inside that's almost like an oily buildup. Yeah. And I feel like the smaller pieces of wood that you use will actually cause more creosote to come through because it's
probably more
burning.
Surface area, and it would burn the surface area, the hotter temperature. I don't know why. Yeah.
So at a minimum, I would want to use wood chunks.
Yeah, that's probably the best. Yeah.
And ideal burning is using a whole log. And so my smoker that I had, which unfortunately this summer we had a big storm come through here in Chicago, and it blew my smoker over and it shattered. And so I said, you know what, I'm going to rebuild a new smoker, and I'm gonna use a real burn box this time, because typically what I would do, I would just set up a little Smoky Joe, and then I would pipe that smoke into my smoker. And so let's actually talk about. Yeah. So let's talk about smokers for a minute.
Sure.
Because again, another tree branch, that's a whole another
all of these topics we could do separate videos. We might 100%. Actually.
Right.
This is fun. This is a lot of fun for me. So go ahead. You were saying that you had this small kettle, or how do you call those, Weber grill or something like that?
Yeah. It's a Weber Smoky Joe.
Okay.
And so it's the smallest little Weber that you can buy.
And then you directed, and we'll have an image of this as well. And then you directed the smoke into your smoker, and have making sure that the length is enough that the smoke cools, right?
Correct. It's for two reasons. So the length of the pipe going into the smoker, there's two things that you have to be cognizant of. Number one is the draw. It has to be able to draw like a fireplace. Otherwise, what's going to happen is you'll never get a good fire going. And number two, it's to allow that smoke to cool off before it enters into the smoke chamber. And so what I would do is I would take a little Weber Smoky Joe. I'd set it off about 4 feet, 6 feet. I'm sorry, it was 2 lengths of pipe. So it was probably about 6 feet, we'll call it. And I would only use aluminum duct. You can't use galvanized duct, because galvanized duct, when it gets heated, will put off a chemical initially
Right.
that will,
Very
it's
good
a
point. Yeah.
carcinogen. So you always want to use aluminum duct, wipe it off, clean the oils off of it, and then you set up a little Weber Smoky Joe, you pipe it into your smokehouse, and by the time it enters into the smokehouse, there's a couple factors, of course, that are going on here. Your external air temperature, all sorts of stuff goes on. But it's always good to put a thermometer in there the first couple of times that you're smoking it this way, and just make sure that it's not getting too hot in the smoke chamber. Now, again, we could get into a lot of theory here, but what's important is that you raise that meat up into your smoke chamber, and you allow that smoke to then build up and kind of work its way up to the meat. And that actually allows that smoke to cool off even more by the time it hits the meat. And then at the top of your smokehouse, you need a vent, because otherwise that smoke won't draft properly.
Yeah,
so it needs a place that
it needs to have a direction, not just going smoke out from the cracks and that sort of stuff.
Exactly. You need a vent, otherwise it won't draft. And without a draft, you're just constantly relighting the fire. Now, again, because I've experimented on my own and tried different things, initially the way I designed that little smokehouse that I have is, my thought was, I'm just going to put the Smoky Joe inside and light the fire, and here we go. And I almost burnt. So
okay, so another point, make sure that your whole contraption is far away from your house or anything that could could damage.
Safety, again, you're literally playing with fire, so safety is extremely important.
Good warning there.
And ideally, if you build a smoker and you experiment with it like I did, and you just kind of, you're trying different things, after doing this for a couple of years, you're going to have a preference. You're going to figure out different things.
Of course.
At that point, invest the time, invest the money if you have the space, and build a real smokehouse out of block. That's the ideal. The ideal smokehouse is built out of block or brick, because there's a couple factors going on. Thermal mass, right? So that block and brick create enough thermal mass, it will stay cool regardless of how much smoke you pump through, and it's permanent, right? So I'm dealing with wood. It lasts 5 to 7 years. It's constant maintenance. If you build something out of block, it's going to last 30 years before you have to mess with it, right? And again, as you know, in the old country, typically when you see a smokehouse, they're probably about, 3 meters tall. You see the vents on the top, and what guys will do is they'll light a fire on the bottom of the smokehouse and then cover it, and it just burns at a very slow rate, and that smoke comes up and then flavors the meat. The other thing that we have to remember is that smoke obviously is a carcinogen, and it has that creosote, that tar, that you don't want on your meat. And so one of the things I just recently was doing research on, I was just doing some research on this. A lot of people in the old country, if they pipe the smoke in, will create what they call a filter. And I got a lot of comments on my videos like, where's your filter? Why aren't you putting a filter? And I didn't understand what they were talking about. And what they do is they'll pipe the smoke in, and then right on top of the smoke, they'll put a little mesh. And on that mesh, they'll put rocks. And what those rocks are intended to do is to catch any of that creosote that's coming in, is to catch that creosote so it doesn't, land on the meat. And
you definitely need something so it's not like directly going onto your meat with all the draft and everything. You'd want something to cover it. It could be rocks, as you said. As long as that settles on the rock instead of going directly to the meat, then you want that smoke to kind of slowly go up and kind of fill the whole space. Very important.
And so now the smoke is nice and cool, and now the question is, well, how long do I need to smoke this? And with my Smoky Joe, the way I have it set up is typically I'll do 4 burns, and I consider each burn 6 hours. And now, is that really accurate? Probably not. I light it. I put a bunch of wood chunks in there. I get a good ash bed going, ember bed rather, I should say, and then throw a bunch of wood chunks in there and cover it up, put the pipe on it. It drafts and it burns for, anywhere between 2 to 4 hours. It's pumping out smoke. And then that period in between, let's say hour 4 and hour 6, there's still a little bit of heat, a little bit of residual smoke coming through. It may not look, what ideally we call it blue smoke. It may not be that blue smoke coming through, but there's still flavor coming through there. So I just kind of figured, okay, each burn is about 6 hours and I want to do 4 burns. And that really is the maximum, in my opinion, for my flavor profile that I want to put on a piece of meat. You could do less, you could do more, it depends on how smoky you want it. 4 is really at the top. I would say 2 to 4 is really good. And if you're just starting out, do 2, which would be quote unquote 12 hours of smoke time, or if you really want and you like that smoke flavor, then you could go and do a little bit more, up to 24 hours. So, and again, each individual cut of meat is going to require a different amount of smoke. So slanina, pork belly, or bacon, you're going to want, in my opinion, a little bit more smoke because it's a very fatty meat. Yeah. And so you want that hard, full flavored smoke to come through when you're eating it. And there's nothing better, in my opinion, than a dry cured pork belly with a little bit of garlic and some Slivovitz on the side. Boy, let me tell you, I'm getting hungry just talking about this.
Okay, so let's walk through it again.
Yeah.
So we have this so awesome information. Thank you very much. Let's so we can make a clip for the people who don't have long enough attention span. Yeah. So and I'll just say it and then you'll walk through it. So the first part was to make sure that you select the meat right.
Correct.
And then you bring it in, you have to trim it. You have to know what you're doing it depending on the cut and how you trim it. And you have awesome videos. So everyone should check out your channel. And then curing, right? 3%. So you measure the meat, the percentage wise from the meat mass, 3% of that goes in as, let's just say, salt this time, right? And then you make sure you turn it enough. And also you leave it enough in that cure for a day per pound, right?
Right.
So it penetrates into the center, right? Now, is there a certain temperature that you should do this? Like, because here in the South and up North, it's a bit different. But that's why this should be a seasonal thing. It should be more for early spring, winter time. But go ahead. Is there a certain percentage or certain degrees that you should do this at?
Right. So it's critical during the equalization period to keep the meat at refrigerator temperature, right? So we want it to be less than 40 degrees, ideally 38, but just above freezing. So really it could be anywhere between 33 and let's call it 40 degrees.
Right.
If you hit 33, the penetration, the curing process takes longer.
Slower, yeah.
Right. So, ideally 38 to 40 is kind of the sweet spot. And then once that meat is cured, now you could raise the temperature on it. Right.
So you go through that. Now you were saying that with the inside the bins, you have to get rid of the water. Do you reapply salt, or do you lose some salt with that?
You absolutely lose some salt, but so I was actually reading a book recently and they were talking about a double putting cure on twice. So if you have 3%, you do 1.5%. Then after it's lost that the first day, then the second day you come back and you add another 1.5%.
You kind of have to know what you're doing if you're doing this. I would probably go with your option first for if you're trying out this the very first time.
I'm kind of indifferent on that process. It really, to me, it's like, it's just an extra step. I could see where it would be important if you're doing a really large piece of meat because
Right.
you're gonna wash off a lot of salt
Mhm.
with that first
Water, yeah.
flush, and then reapplying it a second time. So
If you put too much salt, it will be very dry. So you
yeah.
have to watch out for that. Right. So once that has done, so 10-pound meat, 10 days, then do you have to hang it or dry it before you smoke it, or?
So great question. Yes. And what I like to do now, okay, so one thing that we kind of skipped is now you
Yeah.
can add any flavorings to the meat. So after it's equalized, this is now
A
where
little
you would
paprika
take,
here and there, yeah.
yeah, cayenne, paprika, brown sugar, garlic, pepper, any of the spices that you want to add to your meat. Now is the time to apply. So what you should do is pull the meat out of the bins, hang it in a cold room, somewhere where the temperature is between, let's call it 38 to 50 degrees. And now you would give it a day to dry off. And then you would apply your garlic, paprika, whatever spice you want before it
Mhm.
goes into the smoker for the first time.
Garlic really helps for against like um, bacteria and that sort of stuff. If you do
Right,
cayenne, it could keep the flies off. You want to make sure that
right,
this is in a room where no flies can get in, right? That's
right.
very important.
Very, very important. Yep.
Yeah.
So then you would put it into the smoker and essentially you would smoke it to taste. And then
And
the
you were
next
saying the batches, or not the batch, but a one-time smoke is 6 hours, and then you do two of those roughly. I mean, for your day,
2 to 4. Yeah,
two
two
to
to
four.
four.
Yeah. Okay.
Right, right. Based on your flavor profile.
Yeah, very
Now,
good.
after that, this is probably
And
the
that's where we
second.
are right now. So do
Yes.
continue.
So
I just
the
wanted to recap. So if somebody like, oh, well, I was taking too many notes,
yeah,
now you have the section of the video that you can repeat a couple of times.
right, there you go. So the next step is probably the second most important step in the entire process, and that's actually allowing the meat